we're all working. Today we're looking at past tenses, and so I hope to be able to show you. I think this will work. Yeah. So this is what's on my board at the moment. So I just took a photo of it so that I could show you guys. This is how I understand the past tenses. And I want you to understand that this is the same as the present tenses, except they're in the past. They're exactly the same. Now, what do I mean? I mean that past simple is for regular consecutive actions. Yeah, in present simple, they're regular actions that happen every Saturday, every week, every month, every year. Anything that happens regularly is present simple. But past simple is for consecutive actions. But certainly anything that was regularly happening in the past, anything that happened many times, you can use past simple. You can say, I met him every day for 3 years. In fact, you must. That will sound much better than was meeting or had met or had been meeting. In fact, no, you could say, I have been meeting him for 3 years. And you could say, when I met him that day, I had already been meeting him for 3 years. So that would be possible. And that's because we use these tenses, perfect simple and perfect continuous. I hope you can see my icon or my cursor. But we use perfect simple and perfect continuous. Everything under this line we use to show that it happened earlier than everything above the line, than past simple and past continuous. Okay? Now, the best way to understand this, it really is to have an understanding of how it works in an exercise. And so let's have a look at an exercise and see if we can do it together. And hopefully it will make past tenses a little bit easier. So I've taken this exercise from my favorite website, which is Random Idea English Blogspot. Yeah. You can look at the URL at the top and you can easily find it. If you just type in Random Idea English narrative tenses, you will find this excellent page on past tenses. Now, I've already got the answers in at the moment, and I did that by going to the bottom and clicking show all. But I'm going to click clear all just so that we can discuss them. So I hope you can see from today's class that most of the time when you're telling a story, most of the time you're using past simple because it's one thing, then the next thing, then the next thing. Occasionally, sometimes you need past continuous, and it's very often when you want to set the scene. When you want to tell a story, you often want to put someone in the middle of something. You want to say that I don't know, a man was sitting in the cafe, the clocks were striking 13. I saw that on 1984 today, or last class. But you want to put someone in the middle of an action. And when you do that, you use past continuous. But sometimes you want to talk about something that happened earlier than the consecutive events of past simple. And this is when we use had done or had been doing, yeah, or had met or had been meeting or had lived or had been living. This is when we use the had form. It's very often to show an unfinished period of time, and I think this is important. It's past continuous for unfinished action, and past perfect really for unfinished at that moment period of time. So something like this: he told me that he had been married for 3 years. That period of time, 3 years, was unfinished when he told you. He was still married at that moment. And that's why we say he told me that he had been married for 3 years. So let's have a look at some of the questions then. Let's see. So there was this young girl called, actually, I don't know what she. Now, I hope you can see this is just going to be past simple. What she was called. Yeah, this was just what she was called. It's right at the start of the story. We don't want to say that she was in the middle of being called something. It's just generally true that regularly she was called this. Actually, I don't know what she was called really, because I only ever... Okay, if you know that here is a stative verb, this is much easier because remember, stative verbs can't be used in continuous. So we know it isn't I only ever was hearing. We know it's not that, and we know it's not had been hearing. It's got to be I only ever heard, or I have only ever heard, or say I had only ever heard. Now, here, the Roald Dahl has chosen to say, because I only ever heard, and there's not much difference between I only ever heard and I had only ever heard. The only difference is that when you put in the had, it makes it clear that the narrator is saying that in his life, he had only ever heard up to that moment her being called by her nickname. Now, there's not much difference between saying because I only ever heard and I had only ever heard. And so please understand that many times in English, you do have two options available. Here is a good example. We could use past simple, but we could use past perfect as well. Now, Roald Dahl has happened to use past simple. I only ever heard. But that doesn't mean that he couldn't have chosen past perfect. He could have chosen past perfect here. And I want you to remember this when you're doing exercises online, because I think very often these exercises, when you go down to the show all, and this is one of my favorites, by the way, this is my favorite website, but unfortunately, what a lot of exercises don't tell you is that there is more than one correct answer. There are more than one correct answers. Not sure about that. Need to check my subject verb agreement. I think it's there are more than one correct answers. So please bear that in mind, that you will see answers where you give a different answer and you don't understand it because you think, well, my answer makes sense. Maybe it does. Yeah, maybe it does. So please understand that just because your answer is different from the answer in the book or on the website doesn't mean that your answer's wrong. I think people have an incorrect impression that tenses are much stricter than they are. Sometimes it really does sound wrong. For example, when a person says something like at 3 o'clock and then they say I have met or I have been, that sounds really wrong. Avoid it. If you say time, never use present perfect. But sometimes past perfect or past simple are both possible. So let's come back here. So Roald Dahl said, I only ever heard her being called by her nickname, Ruddy Wee Hoodie. At least I think it was her nickname. It was how they usually, look at these regular, usual, common events, just like in present simple, they're now in past simple. It was how they usually referred to her in the village anyway. I always assumed, yeah, past simple, it's a regular thing that was always the case. However, once again, I had always assumed is not wrong, is perfectly correct. And if Roald had used the writer, if the writer had used had only ever heard, then he may have chosen I had always assumed, because it puts him more in the story. It makes the narrator part of the story, because we're hearing a little bit about his own life, that he had only ever heard her being called by this nickname, and he had always assumed. It kind of tells us about his moments in his life up to that time. But there's very little difference, if I'm honest. You know, when I sit there and explain that one makes it very clear that it happened before, it happened earlier, that's the perfect tense, yeah. I think to a native ear, I had always assumed, I always assumed, sounds almost identical in terms of meaning. And that's often the case. So please be aware that very often two options are available. Okay, so hi Sarah, hi Victor, and hi Justin. I always assumed that it came from, yeah, that the name came from, again, we're not going earlier in the story, so we don't need past tense here, past perfect, but I had always assumed that it had come from. You could use it. You could, if you're going to put had always assumed, you could put had come from as well. And so I'm pointing this out just because I think that this is rarely told. Well, I think foreign students are rarely told this important piece of information, that sometimes you could use either. Okay, that it had come from that it came from the red hooded top that she wore, yeah, day in, day out. This is regular. Yeah, it's regular. She's still wearing it at the moment that the narrator is speaking, and she will be wearing it for the foreseeable future. So it's something regular, and that's why we use this past simple. For all of that is past simple. You can see there's not a little bit, there are no other tenses in that first paragraph, it's just all past simple. Okay, anyway, one day her mother told, so this is the next event in the story. Yeah, do see past simple as consecutive events. Yeah, 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. That's past simple. So first we find out that we don't know what she was called. Then he only ever heard her being called by her nickname. Then it was how they referred to her. Then it was what he assumed. Then the name came from, then she wore. And so now the next thing is, one day her mother told her to take a basket filled with goodies to her granny, who happened to live on the other side of the forest. And this is again just the next thing in the story, so we need past simple. Sorry, I forgot to tell you that this girl lived in a small cottage on the edge of the forest. Now, this is a good example of here. We could say lived, we could say was living, we could say had lived. I forgot to tell you that this girl had lived in a small cottage. We could, but that would change the meaning, and we could even say had been living. So all 4 answers are possible in number 9 with a difference in meaning, okay? This is, I think it's a hard exercise, but mainly because there are several different correct answers, and that does make it a lot harder. But that's the truth with tenses, that it's not that there's only one correct answer. Quite often there are several correct answers. So hi, David, and hi, Hardiel. Let's go back to this exercise. So, but Roald Dahl has chosen to use the past simple. I forgot to tell you that this girl lived in a small cottage. Now, lived sounds more permanent than was living. If you use was living, it sounds temporary, that this girl was living in a small cottage on the edge of the big forest. If you say had been living, it just sounds like it's a moment that started in the past and continued to that moment. So that's okay here. And you could even use had lived, but that does sound like maybe that process completed at the moment that the narrator's telling the story. And so maybe she had lived there on the edge of the forest until that moment, but soon she would go and live somewhere else. Okay, and that she, now this must be past perfect, had spent. And it's because of these signals right at the end of the sentence, up until that fateful day. So we're talking about a period of time up until that fateful day is the now. Well, it's not the now here because it's the past moment that the narrator is referring to. This bit is the past moment, but it happened before that past moment. In fact, let's put it that he told me as the past moment. Let's get that sentence back up. So I forgot to tell you that this girl, she lived in a small cottage at the edge of the big forest, and that she had spent. Notice that this is referring to all the time that started before all of this story. It started before that, and it's gone on until this day that the narrator is describing right now, and he's describing this day in past tenses, past simple. And so this had spent is before all of those verbs. It started before all of those verbs, and it continued up to that moment, up until that fateful day. So this one really does have to be past perfect. But please bear in mind that this is not always the case. It's mainly the case when you get a signal like up until. Up until that day, that's a signal that it's got to be a perfect tense. Okay, she set off in a happy mood. The sun was shining, and through the trees the birds were singing. Now let's look at these 3. She set off is the next action, and it's what she did next, and she finished it. She left. She set off, she left in a happy mood. But then we've got a verb, the sun was shining and the birds were singing. Notice that what we really mean is that the sun was in the middle of shining. The birds were in the middle of singing. They started earlier than Ruddy Wee Hoodie. These things started before she set off in a happy mood, and that's why we use past continuous to show that these actions were in the middle, were in progress. They were happening when she set off. So the sun was shining, the trees were singing. It was just as though everyone. Now, he could have said were waiting, and I recommend were waiting. It is the subjunctive form, but he hasn't. He's chosen the indicative. He's chosen it was just as though everyone was waiting. But we definitely need past continuous because they would be in the middle of waiting for Walt Disney to come and draw the scene. So we've got a few past continuous verbs here, and please look out for past continuous. When you're reading, you'll notice that it sets the scene, past continuous. It very often starts the paragraph or the story, because then you're setting the scene, you're depicting to the reader exactly what things looked like. And the sun was shining, the birds were singing, people were getting ready for work, children were packing their school bags. All of these things help you to set the scene. Hello, Otto. Nice to see you. So we've got 3 past continuouses then. And then we come on to a past simple. What could possibly spoil such a perfect day? Okay, what indeed? Now, while is a signal for continuous, for past continuous. While she was walking through the forest, she saw a wolf strolling. Now, we'll talk about the strolling in a second, but while she was walking through the forest, she saw a wolf. Yeah, the walking was going on for a long time. She started walking before she saw, she finished walking after she saw. So we want to say while she was in the middle of walking through the forest, she saw, yeah, she wasn't in the middle of seeing, but just she saw, past simple, a wolf strolling. Now, strolling isn't a tense. I'm actually quite surprised that the writer on this website has included strolling, because I would call strolling a participle, really. It's not a tense, and so it's not a finite verb form, so it can't be in a tense. So this one's just a participle. So a minute or so earlier, the wolf had been watching. And this must be perfect tense because of the a minute or so earlier. Notice that watch is a dynamic verb. It's continuous. And that's why it's in the continuous form, had been watching and not had watched. I mean, you could say a minute or so earlier, a wolf had watched her, but that sounds like you're going to tell us the result of what happened. So I think we just want to say that a wolf had been watching her from behind a tree, and he had thought to himself she would make a nice juicy meal. But as he didn't want to frighten her, this is the next thing in the story, he didn't want to frighten her off, he had already decided. He had decided earlier. There's nothing wrong with using decided instead here. You could, but he had decided earlier to play it nice and cool. Now, I wanted to do that, to go through an exercise like that, just to show you that there are a lot of exercises online that may sound as though only one answer is correct, when actually a number of different answers could be correct. Quite often, especially when natives in everyday English, quite often natives will use past simple instead of past perfect, even on occasions when they really must use past perfect. So that's the first confusing thing to notice, that natives don't always use past perfect correctly. Secondly, yeah, sometimes there's very little difference between seeing things as a previous period of time and consecutive actions. So sometimes, as we just saw, past simple and past perfect are both correct, but with a very slight difference in meaning. Okay, so I hope that's been interesting for everybody. I just wanted to talk about past tenses today, and so that we'll finish there for today. But I have got an exercise where I've chosen parts from George Orwell's 1984, and you'll be looking for the tenses, the past tenses, and I want you to see if you can get them as George wrote them in the novel. So this will be on my website in about 5 minutes. I'll put it immediately up there, as well as this class. As soon as it's uploaded to Odyssey, I'll put this class up there as well, and it will be on the pages on the page on tenses. So I better write down in the tab what that page URL is. So here is the URL for tenses. I think it's just skypelessons.com tenses. Yeah, nice and easy. So it's it here. So if you go on this page in a little while, there will be this class, and there will be an exercise. Scroll right down to the bottom and click at the bottom for an exercise. And I've taken the words out from 1984. You've got to put them in the correct tenses. Okay, I think something may have gone wrong, so we'll end stream there. Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. See you all soon.